It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Laurie Santos, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at Yale University and Director of the Comparative Cognition Laboratory at Yale. Dr. Santos explores the evolutionary origins of the human mind by comparing the cognitive abilities of human and non-human primates. Her experiments focus on integrating methodologies from cognitive development, animal learning psychology, and cognitive neuroscience. So let's welcome Dr. Santos, the monkey whisperer, and hear about the evolution.
Well, thank you for that great introduction. And let me begin by actually thanking the sponsors, especially the SAR and the Leakey Foundation, not just for inviting me here, but for really their continued and invaluable support of the science of human origins. And I hope to tell you a little bit about that science today, just a small piece of it, but one that I think will actually be quite relevant to the financial times of today. But just to give you guys a sense of where you're going, because I'm a comparative psychologist, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this field actually is and give you a very short introduction to comparative cognition. Then I'm going to turn to the topic that we've been focused on most recently, human irrationality. What can we learn about irrationality by studying our closest living primate relatives? And then I'm going to tell you about some of your own economic biases. You don't need me to do this, of course, because you can read the Wall Street Journal and look at the news and see these biases, but I'll remind some of you of them in case you've forgotten recently, and then tell you about some economic work in Capuchin monkeys. But I like to start my introduction to comparative cognition with the thing that keeps me up at night, a fundamental observation about the world that I think is really perplexing. And it's an observation about the world that you can see pretty much anywhere. I picked somewhere local just so you can see it. Maybe you recognize this. But the observation is just this. If we look out at the world, it's tremendously complicated. Far too complicated for any artificial system that we can create to make sense of. Yet we, without realizing it, do this all the time. This is the puzzle of human cognition. The fact that we can look out at this world, this big visual array with all this stuff, events, all kinds of things going on, and we don't see a mess like artificial systems see. We instantly see a world that makes sense. So you can look out into this display and pick out specific things, these occluded objects, that we can't get natural systems to do. Not only picking them out, you can actually categorize them into different kinds of things, and then use them to make meaningful decisions about how to act towards these things and make decisions in your own life. This is fundamentally a problem because this is too computationally complicated for our best systems to figure out, yet we do it all the time. The question I'm really interested in is, how on earth do we become a species that can do this? How do we grow from a small infant that perhaps can't do this as well as an adult human and actually do it every day so fluidly that we don't actually even notice it? We, of course, as a species, have some help with this. You know, I have my iPod up here to help me tell the time. It also helps me with a GPS to navigate through this stuff. We also have the tools of language and culture and formal teaching. Other species face almost just as complicated a world, yet they seem to also make sense of it quickly and easily without even thinking about it. And that's what I'm most interested in. How on earth do we make sense of this complicated cognitive world? You know, how did we become the kind of species that can do this? And if you're interested in this question of cognitive origins, then you have two ways to study it as a psychologist experimentally. Really try to look at the origins and see what is cognition like at the very beginning. One way that you can do this, the first way that my colleagues in the psychology department at Yale use a lot, is to take what you might consider a developmental approach. You know, at some point, all of us were this guy on the human couch over here. We lack the kinds of experiences with the world that you guys have as adult humans. But over the course of time, we gained certain experiences with language and teaching and so on that turned us into adults. The question is, what does cognition look like at its earliest stages? And how does this change over the life course as we gain access to these experiences throughout our lives? That's approach number one. But today I'll tell you about approach number two, which looks not over developmental time, but over phylogenetic or evolutionary time. I mean, this is a picture that should look familiar to most of you as you walked in because I've stolen it, of course, from the Leakey Foundation. But in fact, it's the same logic as that developmental couch. The idea would be to study what this guy knew about his cognitive world, how he made sense of it, in the absence of human culture and iPhones and so on, and to try to see how evolutionary experiences over time actually shaped, via natural selection, the kinds of abilities you see possible in adult humans. If you're interested in cognition specifically, though, this approach is a little hard because it's hard to find the right subjects to do this work. Because for the most part, all of these direct guys are actually dead. We have access amazingly to their stones, their material culture, and their bones, and so on. But to actually look at cognition, it's a little bit hard. So what we use to do this approach is to actually take a slight proxy. Rather than looking at our direct phylogenetic ancestors, we use the living primates as a bit of a proxy. So now I'll introduce you to your primate tree in case those of you haven't seen your primate relatives recently. This gives you a quick schematic of your primate tree back to about 60 million years. And it's with apologies to the population that my colleagues at Yale study. This is the Yale undergraduate. He's also there to remind some of us at least that, remember, evolution isn't a ladder with humans on top. We're all equal at the top. But I could have chosen anyone. But the group that we study are actually the three most distantly related branches of primates, the guys that are most distantly related to us. And they're represented here by the three guys at the top and furthest left of the chain here. The first group of primates we study are the prosimian primates. These guys are represented by a group of lemurs that we study down at a reserve in Florida. And it's home to a couple different species, and it's great for us because we can actually, in a very naturalistic setting, get up close and personal with these guys and study how they make sense of the cognitive world. The second group of subjects we focus on is closer to home, both evolutionarily and geographically. These guys are the New World monkeys, the most distantly related branch of monkeys. They branched off from our own line about 35 million years ago. And we get to study a group of these capuchins that live at a zoo enclosure at Yale. We have 10 of them over at Yale, and they can live as naturalistically we can, given that they're in a zoo enclosure. But it allows us to do the kinds of studies I'll tell you about in a second, really trying to look at their cognition with some training and where we can really kind of get at whether they think like humans do. The third group we study is the next branch of monkeys, these guys here. These are old world monkeys, more closely related to us than the capuchins. We actually study them on another naturalistic setting. This is the island of Cayo Santiago, which is right off the coast of Puerto Rico. And great for us is that it's home to 1,000 free-ranging monkeys. They kind of run around and do their monkey thing. But relevant for us is that we can actually set up experiments for them, test what they know about the world in the wild. This is me doing a little number experiment with a rhesus monkey. So this is the big approach for comparative cognition, trying to look at what cognition looked like at its earliest origins. If you're in this business, though, you quickly might realize that we run into a bit of a problem. And it's a problem that's nicely illustrated, I think, by the developmental couch, in part because there was a recent scientific article about it. Because if you're thinking about, well, what does cognition look like at its earliest stages, at its earliest origins, you might run into a problem. And that problem was nicely articulated by this article. This is the title of the article. It was not published in a scientific journal, but in The Onion. But here's the big point, is that if you're interested in the origins of cognitions, maybe you might not think you'd find much. As the study reports, babies are, quote, so stupid, it's not even funny. And here's some of the kinds of experiments. I don't know how they got approval at their university to do these kinds of studies, but so this is a very funny article, and it actually appears on the walls of lots of psychologists' offices. And it's not because we really, believe these experiments are good ones and so on. It's because it's funny, because if you're paying attention to the news recently, you're learning that even though it seems like babies should be pretty stupid, it turns out scientifically they seem to have a really striking capacity to understand the way the world works. So here's just some fast headlines to give you a sense that babies aren't, perhaps as stupid as you might think. Here's some work by my colleague Karen Wynn at Yale University, suggesting that by even 6 months of age or 5 months of age, babies have a rudimentary sense of arithmetic. And the way Karen Wynn and colleagues have looked at this is to actually present babies with little mathematical magic tricks, where they try to see whether babies can detect the outcomes of simple arithmetic events. So you show babies events in which one Mickey Mouse doll is placed into a box, the box is hidden, and then a second Mickey Mouse is placed in, and then you just asked, what do babies expect in the box? And what you find is that when you show them the expected outcome, where 1 + 1 = 2, babies are kind of bored by this event, they don't think very much of it. But if you show them an unexpected event in which 1 + 1 seems to equal 1, then babies actually stare at this event for a long time, suggesting that just like you as an adult human, they might be surprised when arithmetic doesn't equal what it's supposed to equal. These are similar kinds of things, sort of looking longer at this unexpected event, that you can sometimes see when you test babies' knowledge in the social domain. So here's another quick experiment by my colleague Karen Wynn, suggesting that babies actually can detect and evaluate other individuals' actions towards other agents. So how do they do this? The same sort of way. You show babies puppet displays in which little objects are moving around. They're just simple objects on the screen, but you don't see them that way. You see them as agents, perhaps a red ball that was trying to get up. That yellow square was nice to it. And now you can see what happens with the triangle. Usually we get laughter here, and that's because you're not seeing these as geometric shapes. You're evaluating them as either nice or mean, kind or hindering, and so on. To see whether babies evaluate in the same way, after watching these events, babies are then given a choice to play with one of these two objects. And what Karen Wynn and colleagues found is that babies selectively play with the object that was nice, even by about 6 months of age. So by 6 months of age, it seems like babies are evaluating perhaps even moral events and treating them just like you guys did when you watched those displays. But these kinds of increased and sort of amazing capacities aren't just true of human infants. You can see the same kinds of capacities in our evolutionary relatives, the primates. Here's me sort of tooting my own horn and talking about the work that was mentioned before, suggesting that monkeys might have something like an understanding of other minds, something like an understanding of what others see. Here's just a quick and dirty experiment we did to look at this. You give monkeys the option to steal pieces of fruit that belong to different human experimenters. And you ask, will they do this more when a human experimenter doesn't know or can't see? And what you find is that even on the first trial, without any experience, the monkeys are actually quite good at this, suggesting that they pick up on the same kinds of cues that we humans use to figure out who knows something, when you can cheat, when you can't, and so on. So the idea is that what we're learning as scientists is that babies and non-human primates are in fact not as stupid as you might think. The claims out there in the field are things like that they have the capacity to compute numerical results of arithmetic, they have theories of the physical world by 6 months of age, and that they can use mental states, things like goals and perceptions, to explain and evaluate the behavior of others. Like, this is rich, interesting stuff. And the picture is that at its earliest origins, cognition is pretty smart, sort of impressively smart as you might think. This is the view that we're getting from developmental psychology and from comparative psychology. The sad thing, though, is that if you start thinking of what psychologists are learning about adult humans, we don't get the same picture. Because if cognition seems smart at its earliest origins, as adult humans, it seems like we make a number of errors. And I'm picking again on the Yale undergraduate, but the sad truth is it's not just Yale undergraduates that do this. In fact, all adult humans seem to share an amazing number of really systematic biases in a number of contexts. So the real headline seems to not be that babies are stupid. The headline from Psychology Today is that adult humans are very stupid. And if you need convincing, there are a number of books on the market that you can look to try to get a sense of this. The amazing thing, though, is not just that we do stupid things. The amazing thing is that we do stupid things, it seems, systematically, predictably. Even in the face of evidence against our behavior, we continue to use the same bad strategies. And this is striking because it suggests that the normal way we might go about learning that our behavior is wrong somehow isn't kicking in. But the problem is that we know very little about where this behavior comes from. How did we as an adult human become the kind of creature that's predictably irrational, that's predictably bad at making decisions? And this is where we got into our work because we thought, well, hang on, this is an area where the comparative approach might be really helpful. We can figure out the origins of our bad behavior. Maybe that can help us figure out ways to actually make ourselves better. So this is the big question that drives the work is, where does this stupid cognition, these errors actually come from? What is the origin of this stuff over evolution and over development? And here's where we face a dilemma, which is that usually we have good answers to where cognition comes from. Usually they come from things like experience, cultural learning, training, but this doesn't really make sense when you start thinking about errors. Because presumably all these mechanisms we have to learn, to teach others, and so on, should yield normative, correct mechanisms, not errors. And so this is what led us to our current hypothesis, which is that perhaps at least some of the dumb things that adult humans do aren't there because we learned to do them in a very dumb way. Perhaps they're there because natural selection shaped these strategies, and they're there from the very beginning. That means they should emerge without experience, and therefore be persistent in the face of experience. But also it suggests they might be evolutionarily pretty old. And so this is why we turn to non-human primates to try to see, well, can we see the same kinds of errors that humans make in human-like contexts in non-human primates? And so that was what led us to the economic domain. And first, before I get into my studies with monkeys, I'll just turn to humans again, because this is an area in which we know a lot about the way that humans go wrong, both from economics and from psychology. Folks have long been interested in the way that humans make economic choices. Of course, economic choices are tough ones. The idea is we have to think about, what is going to actually make us happiest, what's going to increase our wealth level the most. Typically, when economists think about this, they have assumptions about how humans do it. They tend to think of humans as what's often called Homo economicus, this kind of rational man, this perfect robotic-like computer who can compute all the possible outcomes out there and come up with the best decision. The problem, of course, is that real humans aren't like these robotic Homo economicus. We're not rational men. We're just using the machinery that biology gave us to make these decisions. And of course, some of these kinds of things can go wrong. The surprising thing, though, seems to be that it seems to go wrong perhaps more than we actually expect. If you think we're using a certain kind of machinery, it might actually look more like this. But I'll first tell you a little bit about how your choices and all of our choices sometimes are irrational. And for this, I'll have to start by thanking the guys who gave us this work. This is Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who won a Nobel Prize for their work, showing the ways that people systematically violate the tenets of rational choice. And they identified two features that we're most interested in when thinking about non-human primates. The first of these is a bias that they call reference dependence. Now, from a rational standpoint, you might think that the way we should make decisions is to think about our overall wealth level or our overall happiness, and we should try to maximize that. This is what economists tell us we should be doing. It turns out that people don't or can't think like that. Rather than think of their overall wealth level, they tend to just pay attention to where they are at any given moment, the status quo or the reference point, and then think about changes in their wealth level from that point to another. So if you think about what might happen if you parked at a meter tonight and you went outside and you had a parking ticket, I think you would see the parking ticket and you wouldn't say, oh no, now my entire net wealth level is blah, 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 now my entire savings account looks like this. You would say, parking ticket, because you're thinking in terms of the status quo, which is you're in here and you don't have a parking ticket, then you go outside, all of a sudden a parking ticket is there. You've moved away from the status quo in the negative direction. This is reference dependence, this idea that we see things in terms of a status quo, and we only pay attention to movements plus or minus to that status quo. The parking ticket example also nicely illustrates the second phenomena, which is called loss aversion, which is that certain movements from the status quo matter more than others. Movements in the negative direction, movements into the red, hit us much harder and much worse than movements in the positive direction. So my guess is that your emotional system would be much more engaged were you to get a parking ticket for $20 than were you to find a $20 bill on the ground. And this is because we hate going into the red, and it seems like we'll actually work very hard to avoid it. It turns out we work twice as hard to avoid losses than we do to seek out corresponding gains. But to see these kind of practices in your own life, imagine that our sponsors are incredibly more generous than they already have been to the science of human origins, and they'll allow me right now to conduct a very costly experiment where I'm able to give each and every one of you in the audience $1,000. So this is probably more than we're able to do. I'll check with the sponsors in a second, but imagine that they're going to do this. You're each given $1,000, and now you have to participate in another choice. Here are your options. You either can take a gamble now, so you can take a 50-50 shot to get another $1,000 or get nothing. So this is your gamble, $1,000 or nothing. Or you can just take another $500 from the sponsors with certainty. We just give it to you. And so here's the audience participation part. How many of you guys go with option number A, the risky option, the gamble? Okay, how many of you guys go with option number B? Yes, you guys are very risk averse. You look very much like the Princeton undergraduates that Kahneman and Tversky studied. Okay, so that's fair enough. You seem very risk averse. Watch what happens when we do a slightly different version of the same kind of scenario. So now we're able to give each of you guys $2,000. This sounds like a great deal, except you have a choice of giving some of this money back, of losing some of it. You either can take a gamble to either lose $1,000 or lose nothing. So this is the gamble. You lose $1,000 or you lose nothing. Or you can just give back the $500 with certainty. Now, I hear a lot of you laughing, and I bet that's because, like Princeton undergraduates, your intuitions here are changing. Now you don't want to be risk averse. Now you want to go with the chance that you're not going to lose anything. And here is reference dependence and loss aversion in action. Nothing's different between these scenarios, just your perception of the way you started, your reference point or your status quo. And the reason you get riskier here is that you have the possibility to lose nothing. And the idea of avoiding a loss altogether is extremely salient to us. This is just one of the ways these biases play themselves out. You get riskier when you're dealing with losses. It's the kind of thing that might be very important to financial markets, as you might see right now when people are in a loss mode. But it also generates all kinds of things that we see going wrong in markets historically and today. Loss aversion and reference dependence are often thought to be the culprits behind a problem in the stock market, known as the equity premium puzzle. The equity premium puzzle is just the idea that people tend to invest more in bonds than stocks than they should, given the return on both. So historically, over the last 100 years or so, stocks have generated 7% more in terms of their growth than bonds. Yet people tend to overly invest in bonds despite the fact that they're not doing well. Why? Well, it seems like one of the bad things about stocks is that they're very volatile, much more volatile than bonds, which means sometimes your stocks are going to go into the red. And people have to be compensated to avoid this. They actually invest in bonds more than they should, perhaps because of this loss aversion that they never like to see the red. Turns out people end up losing about 7% for every bond that they have instead of a stock. The most amazing thing about this bias is that it's not just true of lay people, it's actually true of Nobel Prize-winning economists. So Harry Markowitz actually was an economist who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the formal properties of how to figure out how many bonds and how many stocks to have in your portfolio. However, when you looked at his own portfolio, he didn't use that logic that he came up with. He had 50% of his money in bonds and 50% of his money in stocks. So even he is so loss averse that he can't get over this. But we also see these biases playing themselves out, I think, quite badly in the current housing market, where one of the main reasons that houses aren't selling as much as they are is that people who are selling houses are very loath to reduce their price, especially to reduce the price below what they bought a house for, even if that's the best financial strategy for them right now. Again, people are setting reference points not based on overall amounts, like the real value of the house, but typically what you thought your house was worth in 2006, which, because the market then tended to be very high. And thinking about the value of your house dipping below that feels like a loss, even though overall it might not map on to the real value. Here are these biases playing themselves out in the housing market, but these biases play themselves out in all kinds of crazy human contexts, even on the golf course, it turns out. A bunch of economists have looked recently at golf scores and have claimed that, in fact, professional golfers do worse because of these two biases. And what you know if you're a golfer yourself is that a golfer's overall level of success is not based on any individual hole, it's based on the overall score at the end. Unfortunately, every single hole has an extremely salient reference point, namely par. And it turns out that even professional golfers behave differently when they're shooting above par, and it feels like a gain, they're not going to kind of lose anything, versus below par. And even professional golfers, it turns out, are riskier when they're shooting and they might actually go under par. And these economists' devise actually seems to lose professional golfers millions of dollars every single year. The neat thing, if you're interested, is that they computed the loss aversion score for every single golfer. Tiger Woods was one of the worst on the PGA Tour. Infer what you'd like from that. I'm not going to go there with Tiger Woods these days. But I'll tell you about one last way that these biases play themselves out in real markets. And that's a phenomenon known as the endowment effect. The idea that goods that we own seem to be overvalued in our life, valued more to us than they are to anybody who doesn't own these goods. And Danny Kahneman and colleagues tried to study the effect of this by actually making subjects in a lab owners of a new object and trying to see how that changed how they valued certain objects. And they did this with university mugs, which is why the mug is up there. So they brought subjects into the lab and said, okay, subjects, you guys on this side of the room would be mug sellers, and you guys on this side of the room are going to be mug buyers. You mug sellers, I'm going to give you this mug. You now own the mug. It's yours to do with what you want. You mug buyers, I'm not going to give you a mug, but I'm going to give you some money. You could choose to buy the mug if you would like. And now I just picked you guys randomly, so some of you mug sellers might want to get rid of the mug and take the money, vice versa. So I'll stick you guys in a market and figure out when you're willing to sell the mug and when you're willing to buy it. So they gave subjects different price schedules, different prices at which they might be willing to sell or buy. And they started with very low prices, and of course at low prices, all buyers think it's a great deal to buy the mug, and no sellers think it's a good deal to Sell a mug, this makes sense. The question is, when do you see the flip over? And what you find is somewhat shocking, but it seems like the flip over doesn't actually match as you expect it might. It turns out that sellers actually demand over twice as much as buyers are willing to pay to part with their object. This is something like an eBay effect where people have these objects that they think are very valuable and no one else seems to think so. Well, why? Turns out the culprit might again be reference dependence and loss aversion. When you're a mug seller, you own the mug, your status quo is having the mug, and when you think about selling it, you think about giving it up or losing it. And the magnitude that that feels to you seems to be twice as much as those of you who would be in the position of buying would feel to actually obtain the good. This leads to a very funny disconnect in the market between sellers and buyers that economists really care about, of course, to have fluid markets, but it seems again to be the result of these kinds of biases. And so with all these biases in place, we became very interested in whether we could actually study the same kinds of phenomena in monkeys. And the reason is to try to figure out where do these biases come from and how can we actually change them around over time. And so to do this, I teamed up with my fabulous graduate student, Venkat, and also Keith Chen, who's an economist at the School of Management. And we tried to actually study whether we could see similar biases in Capuchin monkeys. And our logic was, if we can, it might mean that the parsimonious explanation is that these kinds of strategies arose way down here in evolutionary history. That they're the kinds of things that might be 35 million years old. But there's a problem with this, which is that, of course, the right way to do these kinds of studies is the way they're done in humans, would be to give the monkeys some money and try to give them gambles and see how they made decisions just like you guys. Of course, this is a little tricky for us, but we did what we think was the next best thing, which is that we introduced our monkeys to a new little Capuchin fiat currency, these little metal washers that we taught them could be traded with experimenters for food. And so how did this actually work? Well, we brought the monkeys from their zoo enclosure out into a little testing box so they could be by themselves. Once they were in their testing box, they were given a little wallet of tokens, and we just trained them to hand them over to human experimenters for food. Turns out this actually goes by pretty fast. Here are 5 monkeys that we started with this, and the training takes 3 quick steps. You reinforce the monkey, in other words, give them food for touching the token, then for picking it up, and then for placing it in the experimenter's hand. Steps 1 and 2 take place immediately because these guys are curious and sort of picking up these objects, and then they actually learn the second step really quickly. Our male monkeys learned this before in their former life at Yerkes Primate Center, and our females learn this extremely quickly, just 20 sessions of 10 trials each. And once the monkeys get good at this, they get quite fluid at this. Here's a little video of what monkey trading looks like. I always joke that my graduate student, Venkat, sort of missed his calling making sort of weird French films, but this is what you have. When the monkeys get really fluid at this, they're happy to trade their tokens with humans for food. So now we said, aha, now we can actually put the monkeys in a market, measure their choices just like I did for you, giving you choice A, choice B, and see what they prefer. So it starts with the monkeys getting their wallet of tokens, and now they're getting a choice, this time between 2 experimenters, which basically represent 2 different shops. They're different people, different undergraduate students at Yale, who are wearing different clothing, and they're offering different amounts of food to the monkeys at different prices. And then we can train the monkeys in this market by setting them up so that the monkey enters a little testing cage, they get their wallet of tokens, the traders are going to kind of pop up on each side, and then they show the monkeys what the monkeys can buy by showing a little dish filled with food. So the monkeys can see, oh, that's how much I get for 1 token from this guy, that's how much I get from the other guy. And then the monkey makes his choice. Basically, he pays one of the 2 experimenters, and then the experimenters sort of swap sides. Actually, they pay the monkey the food, and then they kind of swap sides and keep repeating until the monkey spent all his money. And so this is a little video of what this looks like. You have to excuse the kind of gear we wear with our monkeys when they're in their testing enclosure, but here is how it goes. Monkey gets his wallet of tokens. Here's Felix, our alpha male. He's waiting impatiently for the market to open. When is the market going to open? But he checks what he can buy, pays the experimenter, and enjoys his prize. And I'll just let you see a couple of these trials so you can get a sense of how savvy the monkeys are. They're very impatient creatures, but they still pay a lot of attention to what they can get. So he checks both sides, goes to the little monkey ATM, pays one of the experimenters, and goes from there. So we said first, we wanted to be sure that what we were dealing with wasn't some little trick we taught our monkeys. We wanted to see it was really a market. Do they really try to maximize their monkey dollar? And then beyond that, do they show the biases we're interested in? So I like this child because he's really impatient, but he still checks, nope, that's not good. I'll go to this guy, pay this guy, and go from there. Okay, so First question was, or first experiment was, does this market work? Are the monkeys trying to maximize their food dollar as we expect them to? So we bring the monkey in, and in this case, give him a choice between two kinds of experimenters. And you'll see a couple different representations of this. This is just explaining what the experimenter are doing. So this is experimenter blue, and he starts by, in his dish, displaying 2 pieces of apple. So this guy looks pretty good. However, this experimenter, like the gambles you were playing with before, is risky. Sometimes, half the time, the monkey gets both pieces of apple, but the other half of the time, the monkeys only get 1. So this guy's risky, but on average, the monkey's getting 1.5 pieces of apple. That's pretty good. And this guy gets paired with experimenter pink. This guy's safe. He does the same thing on every trial, but he starts with 1 piece of food, and he always only gives that 1 piece of food. So the question is, if you're a savvy monkey economist, who should you shop at? And well, who you should shop at is experimenter blue, because on average, you're getting 1.5 times what you'd get from experimenter pink. And in this and a bunch of other studies, this is what all of our monkeys do. So I'll show you some graphs. I'm just going to plot based on how much they choose experimenter blue. But you can see all the bars are super huge. Basically, with just quick presentations, all 5 of our monkey actors know who to shop at. They shop at the guy who's giving them the most food. And I won't bore you with the details of sort of mapping this to formal models of economics, but trust me, when humans are rational, the monkeys are pretty rational too. More exciting to us, though, are the cases where the monkeys are irrational. Do they also get tripped up by the status quo, just like you guys did? And so here's what we did to look at this. Now the monkeys get a choice. I'll just call them experimenter blue and pink so you can see. This is experimenter blue. He starts with 1 piece of apple. And then he's risky. Half the time you just get that 1 piece of apple, but half the time you get this bonus. This is like finding the $20 on the ground half the time, and on average you're getting 1.5. And we compare how the monkeys play with this guy with experimenter pink. Now, experimenter pink is basically doing exactly the same thing as experimenter blue. He's either giving 1 piece or 2 pieces, riskily, for an average payoff of 1.5, but he doesn't look like a bonus. He looks like a loss, because he always starts with 2, and then half the time the monkeys get less. However, a savvy monkey economist, a sort of homo economicus, would say, well, the monkeys shouldn't care. Both guys are just as risky. They're getting 1.5. But a human monkey, or a monkey like adult humans, would actually hate experimenter pink and go for experimenter blue. And what we found, shockingly, is that all of our monkey actors did just what you would expect a human to do. They avoided the guy that was giving losses. They seemed to pay attention to what you start with, even though it doesn't really matter. We wanted to be sure that this was about losses per se, and so to do that, we gave the monkeys 1 more choice. This time, none of the experimenters were risky. They always did the same thing. This guy shows 1 piece and gives it. He's pretty straightforward. But this guy, to an adult human, this guy would be a big jerk. Every single trial, he shows you 2 and takes 1 away. Again, the homo economicus, the rational man, would say, it doesn't matter, you're getting 1 from anybody, but that's not how the monkeys treat it. All of our monkeys show a strong preference to experimenter blue. It's actually the strongest preference we'd seen in them. It seems like a guy who takes something away on every single trial is really kind of icky to the monkeys. But we wanted to see whether this also affected their risk behavior. Do they also switch their preferences for risk, as you guys did, based on framing? And I love the fact that this sort of work in human behavioral economics was done around the same time in the 80s. There are these bad 80s movies about, there's a time for playing it safe and a time for risky business. I don't know if there's really a movie about economics, but it was what it perhaps inspired Kahneman and Tversky to do their studies on risk preferences changing. Here's just another version of the scenarios you guys played in, but with a slightly different spin. So now your task is to figure out different programs to combat this disease. It's supposed to kill 600 people. You have a couple different options. You first might be asked to choose between program A and program B. Program A is pretty safe. If you choose program A, for sure 200 people are going to be saved. Seems pretty good. If you choose program B, there's a 3rd probability that all 600 people will be saved, and 2/3 probability that nobody will be saved. And if you're having your own intuitions here, you might be like Princeton undergraduates. 72% of them go with program A. They want to be safe when dealing with number of people saved. However, if you give people exactly the same scenarios, but you just word it differently, so now instead of saying the number of people saved, you say the number of people who are going to die, which is exactly the same, of course. People have different intuitions. Now they want to be risky because they want to have the chance that nobody's going to be lost. that nobody's going to die. This particular scenario has enormous medical implications that just by the way you word the consequences of different procedures, it will change the kind of procedure that you would like to accept yourself or give to someone else. Quite scary, in fact, but we wanted to actually see whether the same preference switches can be seen in our Capuchins. So we gave the monkeys choices between risky and safe losses. So now both experimenters here are giving losses. Both start with 3. The risky guy is either sometimes going to give all 3, so sometimes no loss, sometimes a big loss. On average, the monkey's getting 2. And the safe guy over here is going to always start with 3 and always take 1 away. So this is the scenario in which you guys start with 2,000, and you can either take the gamble or you can take the safe bet. If monkeys are like humans, they should want to be risky here. However, they should switch their preferences when we're dealing with gain. So here's the gains version. You start with less, but you get more. Here's the kind of risky gain. This is starting with your $1,000, and you might take a risky gamble of 1,000 more or nothing. Or you could go with the safe bet of just taking the 500. These scenarios are mapping on, yeah? So we predict here that the monkeys should be safe. And what do we find? Well, here's just another graph showing their performance. I'm plotting it in terms of how risky the monkeys want to be. This is what happens when they're dealing with gains, and this is what happens when they're dealing with losses in orange. And what you can see is just what you guys showed. The monkeys, too, are being riskier when they're dealing with losses. I love this graph because it shows some neat individual differences. So some of the monkeys are riskier than others. This guy on the left is pretty compelling because he's actually our alpha male. He's always risk-seeking, which is kind of interesting. But he, even, too, is more risk-seeking when he's dealing with losses than gains. So it seems like our monkeys show the same effect as you guys. They too switch their risk preferences when dealing with losses or gains. So finally, we wanted to see if we could do something like this ownership effect in monkeys. Does this actually change the way monkeys treat objects that they own versus don't own? And to actually look at this, we wanted to first find 2 kinds of foods that the monkeys liked equally. And this just makes our work a little bit easier if we can find foods like this. So we endowed the monkeys with some tokens and then gave them a choice of experimenters. None of them are risky. They're all giving what they promise here. But some of them are giving fruit and some of them are giving cereal. And we picked these 2 goods because we thought the monkeys like them about equally. And it turns out we picked correctly. When we actually test monkeys, on average, they trade about half their tokens for fruit and half their tokens for cereal. So this tells us that the monkeys like fruit and cereal about equally. It also tells us that when the monkeys start with 12 tokens and they get an option to have any different ratio, they like about half fruit and half cereal. So we said, aha, now we can actually do the study we were most interested in. Rather than bringing the monkeys into the lab and giving them their tokens when they come from their enclosure, now they come in and they find a wallet of one of the fruits. They're owners of fruit. And they have the option to trade with one person who's selling the cereal. And what the monkeys just told us in that previous study was that to them, the cereal is equivalent. When they have the option of having half and half, that's what they prefer. The question is if they prefer something different when they're owners of one. And so I'll show you what the monkeys do. Here's what happens to their choice of fruit, how much fruit they consume when they're endowed with the fruit, when they're owners of fruit. So they seem to like fruit. However, when you endow them with cereal, when they're owners of cereal, you see these bars totally change. Here's just a different way of showing you all these same numbers. Basically, what you find is the monkeys keep and eat the good that they own, and they pretty rarely trade it. However, this might not be an ownership effect. This is just showing you that monkeys, if you give monkeys a bunch of food, they'll eat it rather than giving it back to you, right? So we need to make sure that there's some controls we need to do. First, we were worried, well, maybe the monkeys don't understand they can trade food. You know, they've never really had to do it before, maybe they don't get it. And so our logic to test this was to say, well, even if I endowed you all with a mug, if I offered you a Ferrari, most of you would overcome your endowment effect and give me the mug for the Ferrari. So we said, what if we could give the monkey the sort of food version of a Ferrari, a really, really good food, and see if they'll overcome it? In our monkey's world, the 2 favorite foods they have, embarrassingly for our sugar-obsessed monkeys, is marshmallow fluff and fruit roll-ups. So we created these marshmallow fluff fruit roll-up tacos and offered them to the monkeys in exchange for the fruit and the cereal. Now, if they understand they can trade the food, they should be able to overcome their endowment effect, and lo and behold, all the monkeys do. So now, when they get the Ferrari, they understand they can give this up. So that's not what's going on. Another possibility, though, is that it's just kind of costly to actually do the trade. You know, it's kind of a pain to wait for the experimenters to pop up. Maybe it's just a little bit of extra cost that if we gave them that too, plus the cereal, they would not show this effect. And so to get at that, we tried to measure the cost of trading for the monkeys. So we went back to their tokens, and we used just the opposite strategy. We said, what's the smallest possible compensation we can give them for the act of the trade? The smallest payment they'll accept for the token, and that must be some measure of how much of a pain it is. And so the smallest possible compensation in a monkey world is just a tiny Quaker oat. So we had an experimenter who offered 1 oat, and then he kind of upped the ante till he got to the number of oats that the monkeys demanded to take the token. And we said, aha, now this is the cost of the trade. So we'll just add that to the fruit or the cereal. So now the monkeys go back, they're owners of the cereal, or the fruit rather, and then we offer them the cereal plus the extra oats. So we're kind of giving them a little bonus for the cost of their effort. If the effect we saw before wasn't about ownership, then we should see the monkeys go back to what they did before. However, if the monkeys really are experiencing something like an endowment effect, this shouldn't affect their behavior. And so here are just the original data you saw before. This is just how big their endowment effect is in our first condition. Now I'll show you what happens when we kind of compensate them with the extra oats. Basically nothing. The monkeys still show just as big an endowment effect, even when we pay them a little extra. But we wanted to do one more control to make sure our monkeys weren't just sort of upset about the amount of time it took. Because one of the problems with trading is that the object you own you can use and eat right there if you're the monkey. If you're waiting to trade, you kind of have to wait for the guys to pop up. Maybe the monkeys are just bad at waiting for a reward in the future. But luckily for us, nature actually makes goods that we can use to control for this. If we offered the monkeys a nut outside of its shell, we can actually time how long it takes them to break into it and show that buying from an experimenter a nut outside the shell is actually faster than keeping the nut that's inside itself yourself and then opening it and so on. So we're basically offering the monkeys a good deal in terms of time. And so here's how this works. We endow the monkeys with a nut in its shell. It's going to take forever for them to open and eat. And we offer them an equivalent nut that's actually outside its shell. So if all the monkeys were doing before was being very impatient, they should switch their effect here and not show an endowment effect anymore. And so here's what we find. This is the original data you saw before. Here's what happens when we compensate the monkeys for time, except for perhaps this monkey who's very impatient. Basically, we don't see anything. They continue to show this ownership effect, even when we control for everything we can think of. And this highlights to us that, well, maybe it's the same kind of effect we're seeing in humans. So what are the big conclusions here? So when you endow monkeys with some money, what do you see? Well, the first thing you see is that they tend to evaluate their choices the same biased way that we do. They do it in terms of status quo, in terms of reference points, what the experimenter starts out with, which doesn't always map onto what they get. They also seem to exhibit loss aversion, so they switch their risk preferences around when they're dealing with losses. They tend to avoid losses pretty much at the same magnitude that humans do in these scenarios. And finally, as far as we can tell, they show the same kind of ownership endowment effect that we see in humans, even when we control for all the stuff we can think of that could be making a difference. Basically, it seems like the Capuchin monkeys are showing the same economic behavior as we see in humans. So what does all this mean? Well, the interpretation is that at least one of the kinds of errors that humans show systematically in the economic domain seems to be not just us. So it's not just the Yale undergraduate that's showing this stuff. These kinds of biases are shared across the tops of the primate tree, which suggests parsimoniously that if you see them that far across, suggests they might have been true of this common ancestor down here. And that suggests these biases are very old, perhaps even 35 million years old, if you buy the current comparisons. So it seems like these irrationalities in the economic domain are really shared. And that suggests we've learned something about how these biases work, which is that they're not just funny little glitches of language, as some economists have claimed. It's not just that it's weird to talk in terms of people who are dying or saved, because the monkeys don't have any of that, yet they show these same biases. It also can be something specific that we teach ourselves or that experience gives us. And this is a worrying thing for thinking about how to deal with these biases in humans, because if they're not there because of experience, it's going to be really tricky to get rid of them in our own population. And finally, the good news, though, is that it's not due to the kinds of weird economic situations that we have perhaps uniquely as adult humans, like subprime mortgage loans and credit cards and so on. This can't be the only thing that's driving these errors. The coolest thing for us, though, is that we now have a way to actually study these decisions in a non-human primate, and there's so much where we can actually ask them. And so that means there's a lot of places to go from here, lots and lots of outstanding questions. We're really interested in the idea that some of the errors humans see might actually be uniquely our own. built on the smart processes we have. One of these is something known as confirmation bias, the idea that when we design a hypothesis and go out to collect evidence, we often go out and look specifically for evidence that supports our hypothesis. Very, very dumb strategy if you're a scientist, but it relies on abilities that are actually quite smart, namely being a scientist and testing hypotheses. And this leads us to suspect that perhaps there are some errors out there that might be uniquely our own. And here's a spot where we can really start seeing differences in the evolutionary tree, spots where we can answer Jane Goodall's question about, what makes us uniquely human. Maybe it's the dumb things, but at least we'll get some answers here. And then finally, I think we can ask a really interesting philosophical question about, well, why are these errors here in the first place? I mean, they wreak havoc in financial markets, they're causing the housing collapse and so on, but they're 35 million years old. It's a long time for natural selection to just let them sit there. And it suggests that maybe they're not as bad as we think they are. Maybe they might actually be good strategies in some contexts, not the context we find ourselves now as humans, but some contexts that were true of the evolutionary past. And as some researchers have claimed, maybe these biases aren't even biases at all. Maybe they're really the right solutions, and we just kind of apply them really badly. So these are the sort of philosophical implications, but I thought I'd end today with what the implications really are for you guys. What are the kinds of tips you can take away from what we've learned from the monkeys? And I think the big tip is that if we're right about what we've seen in the monkeys, these biases, reference dependence and loss aversion, are extremely old, and it suggests that they're going to be there for a long time to come. Much like other biases shaped by natural selection, perhaps our love for cheesecake and sort of sweet fatty things, or our sort of aversion to creepy crawling things or kind of looming things that are coming at us, it's going to be hard to shut these off. And therefore, we should start thinking about, well, how can we just live with them if we're going to have them anyway? And I think there are a couple tips that we learn about our own decisions. The first is that we need to take this status quo bias, this reference point bias, very seriously. And we need to use it very wisely, because other people are using it against us. This is not a unique kind of advertisement you see. You probably don't know in an arbitrary way, like, how much is a PlayStation worth? What's its real value? But this is a good price because it used to be priced $3.99, and now it's only priced $2.99. These people, advertisers, are using your reference points against you. They're first of all noticing that it doesn't matter how much the thing actually costs. What matters is how much you think it costs relative to what it cost before. And we need to take seriously when we're influenced by these things, when you see these things, when you go to the grocery store and the supermarket and so on, think about how they're actually really affecting your choices. Are they manipulating your status quo? Problem is, we know it's going to be hard to get rid of them. You can't just ignore them, but at least acknowledge that they're there and take them quite seriously. The good news is there's a couple ways you can use them to your own advantage, to feel better about your own decisions. One is to take into account the idea that oftentimes it doesn't matter the absolute amount that you move from your status quo. It's just that you go up or down. It's just that it's a gain or loss. This means it's a good strategy. There are good strategies to feel better about your bonuses and less bad about your losses. One is actually nicely illustrated here when you kind of see, you come home from shopping, you have all your shopping bags together. Turns out, if you're paying attention to your biases, this is a bad strategy, because you have one moment where you walk into the house and you introduce to your spouse, look at all this awesome stuff that I bought. One single gain, one pop up. Remember, we don't care about absolute values, we just care about movements. And what that means is a smart strategy is to actually split up your gains. Every time you go to the store, if you just buy one wonderful thing, then you get the increased kind of change from your status quo every single time. It's very smart to split up the good things that happen in your life. And by the same token, it's also a better strategy to sort of squish together all the losses. Remember, what hurts us isn't the magnitude of getting the parking ticket. It doesn't matter if it's $20 or $50. It's just that it's a loss. So if you have the possibility of sort of squeezing all your losses together, all the bills on the same day, that's actually a good strategy to actually feel better about them. But there's a second thing that I think is really important from this work, which is that these status quo biases are like the stuff I started talking about. They're the kinds of processes that just go on, like detecting objects out there and telling what they are, that we don't even notice. And that means we don't take them into account, and we sometimes make bad decisions. So one other helpful tip from the monkey work is to really take your status quo seriously and remember you're going to get used to these good things that happen to you and the bad things that happen to you. And I think there's an apt quote from the journalist Edgar Watson Howe about this, is that nothing is wonderful once you get used to it. As soon as you get a gain, it's there, you're used to it, and there's no actual change above the status quo. And this means that when we convince ourselves that we really need things in our life, and this is very salient to me because I very much convinced myself that I needed a new 3G iPhone, and then I had it, and there was one really awesome blip from my status quo, and then I was just an iPhone owner, and there was no further awesomeness from the iPhone, But yet that doesn't convince me that I don't necessarily want a new iPad or other kinds of goods that I can't even afford, like a big Ferrari. But the point is, for all of the cool things that are out there, remember that as soon as you get them, you very quickly adjust to a new status quo. And that means that you should take this into account when you're thinking about new objects to get. And this is a phenomenon that economists and psychologists refer to as the hedonic treadmill. This idea that we very quickly get used to how happy things make us, and the good news is how bad things make us feel. And the fortunate and unfortunate events in our life really just become the status quo very, very quickly. And here's another apt quote about this from my colleague Dan Gilbert. He says, "Wonderful things are especially wonderful the first time they happen, but their wonderfulness wanes with repetition." So the first time your spouse told you, "I love you," that was great, but every morning when they leave the house for work, it's like, whatever. The first time your child says, "Mama," that was amazing and important, but you quickly get used to it and sort of annoyed by it, as time goes on. And if you're making economic choices, it's important to remember this and to think about, well, how is it that we can get off this treadmill? How do we stop things from affecting our status quo? And there are a couple good strategies. One is just variety. If you think about, whether you'd like to eat this ice cream cone, the first one you eat is great, but if you keep eating ice cream cones, chocolate, chocolate, chocolate all the time, by the fifth one, this one isn't going to be very good. Well, how do you switch it up? Well, you could just actually switch it up by, this is a sort of little pat example, but the chocolate will taste a lot better at this repetition if you've sort of mixed it up ahead of time. So one way to get rid of your status quo bias from sticking with you is to switch it up a bit. A second way is to manipulate the timing of the goods you've got. You've seen this already a little bit by splitting your gains. You know this from the ice cream example. If the second ice cream comes 14 seconds after the first one, really not as good. 6 hours, getting better, but if you split it by 5 days, now you're seeing something. Timing and changing the timing between your gains and losses can actually affect the way you get used to your status quo. But the best example, I think, and the best hint from the monkey work and the status quo bias is to actually pay attention about what you're buying and buy the right things. And I've underlined things here because things are especially bad with our status quo bias, because things are the kinds of things we can get used to. iPods are good the first time, but you get used to it really quickly. Good kinds of jewelry and sort of things that you buy are the kinds of things that you get used to. Flat screen TVs are great the first time, but then you're just used to a flat screen TV experience, and anything else will just feel sad by comparison. What this means is that wise economic choices actually avoid status quo by being not things, but spending your money on experiences. So a vacation or an experience is something you'll experience once. You don't have time to get used to it. And these are the kinds of things that continually give us pleasure, much more so than things, vacations, wonderful meals, things that you get just once and it's an awesome experience are the kinds of things you can never get used to. So these are smart ways to avoid your own status quo bias. But the final thing that I think economists are telling us is that there might be some ways that just beyond these little helpful tips I've given you, you can use your own economic biases to your advantage. And this is the kind of thing that economists are telling us, not just from a personal choice perspective, but also from a policy perspective. And if you haven't seen the book Nudge by Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein, I'd really encourage you to check it out, because the main thesis of their book is, look, let's assume, based on the monkey work, that these biases are just there. They're going to be hard to change, and they're just going to be the way that we make our decisions. Given that, how can we design policies that allow us to get good goals, even with those biases there in the first place? And they have lots of different suggestions from lots of different domains, from voting to organ donation to savings, of how you can exploit your own biases, and policies can do so to make better decisions. And I'll just give you one example. their new program for savings, which is actually making a big effect in the world of 401ks. So of course, savings are very hard for us because even though we have great intentions of putting money away, we often get a salient reference point, which is our paycheck. And the act of saving is sort of taking money from this reference point, putting it in a savings account. This often feels quite bad to us. But Thaler and Sunstein have come up with a neat program that they call the Save More Tomorrow plan, and it exploits both loss aversion and reference dependence. Well, how does it work? The first thing is that when you start the Save More Tomorrow program, you don't start today. You start saving next year. And so if I asked you, how much do you want to take out of your bank account right now and put in a savings program, you'd say not very much. But if I say in 2011, how much would you do? You're much more likely to commit to it. And this is because things we commit to tomorrow are easier. It's easier to do the diet tomorrow, to save tomorrow, and so on. But you lock people in. So people agree to this quite happily, but they're locked into their savings for next year. And so this exploits our impatience. But the second aspect of this program actually exploits our loss aversion, which is that when your savings come out next year, they come out mostly from a portion of your raises, which means you're used to the reference point of your paycheck level, and you never notice when that level goes down and you start saving over time. Typically, actually, it's not even your entire raise that gets saved, so you might be going from $100 a week to $150, and you still see it as $100 to $110, and you're like, yes! And you don't even realize that that extra $40 or so is going into your savings. So it allows people to save in a way that doesn't give them any loss aversion. And finally, it sort of exploits the status quo bias by keeping all these contributions that you make, increases in your contributions, automatic. Of course, people can totally opt out of any of these at any time. It's not an inflexible system, but because we so get used to the status quo, if you put something in as the default, most people don't want to change it. The good news from this program is it's actually working quite well. Using this sort of strategy means that people are saving threefold more in the first year, and it only increases after that as they go over time. So thinking of policies and ways to really exploit our biases, let's believe that natural selection shaped them. Let's believe they're going to be there. How can we work with them? Turns out to be a very good strategy over time. And with that, I will end with one final thought, which is, I hope I've convinced you that looking at the origins of human cognition, both the smart stuff and the dumb stuff, is interesting, but also, with all respect to Jane, that turning to non-human primates to actually think about this question is really important and interesting. And with that, I will again thank the sponsors and all of my students for their help and so on. Thanks.